I'd like to introduce Carmel Lockman at this time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this forum presented by the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. The topic is, can we lower our property taxes? I am Carmel Lockman, your moderator for tonight's event. New Jersey pays some of the highest property taxes in the nation, and Essex County pays some of the highest property taxes in New Jersey. The League is concerned about citizens understanding facts about thorny, complex public issues like property taxes. We are hoping this discussion may promote a civil dialogue across the political aisle where, at a minimum, facts are not disputed. Thus, the intent of tonight's forum is to offer the public a dispassionate, fact-based presentation about New Jersey taxes. It seems a particularly pertinent topic as April is when many municipalities, like Montclair, are preparing their annual municipal budgets, which will determine the tax levy for the next year. Tonight's presentation is not about political points of view. Two nonpartisan, non-ideological policy experts from the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University will share their nonpartisan experience and expertise with us. I hope you have read their full bios on the League's website. But in short, Mr. Richard Keevey is the former budget director and controller for the state of New Jersey, having been appointed by two governors, each of a different political party. For purposes of this presentation, he is our state tax expert. Our expert on county and municipal taxes is Mr. Marc Pfeiffer. He has over 45 years of service in municipal and state government. He spent 10 years as a municipal administrator and 26 years as a director at the New Jersey Division of Local Government Services. Both are now at Rutgers University. The format of the presentation will be that Mr. Keevey will discuss state issues, and then Mr. Pfeiffer will talk about local issues. The presenters will address questions submitted to them prior to this evening, as well as those in the chat room, which will be monitored by my League colleague, Mr. Peter Brawley. We would like to get through the presentation first and then address your questions. Everyone will be muted at all times, with Mr. Brawley only asking the questions. This presentation is being recorded and will be on the League of Women Voters website with links to related material. It will also be included in Channel 34 programming. So, Mr. Keevey, the floor is all yours.
All right, good evening, everyone. Now, I know everybody is interested in finding out about the property tax burden in the state, but we thought it was important that you get a little overview of the state budget and overall responsibilities of the state government. So let me open up with the first observation there. When people ask me where all the state spending is, they immediately assume it's at the state government. But if you look at that chart that we have up there, you'll see that the state government spends 28% of all of the tax revenue in the state. The majority, 72%, is at the local level, schools dominating it, but also municipalities and counties. And one of the reasons why the state is only 28% is because all of the income tax money, and we'll talk about the taxes in a few minutes, all of the income tax money by a constitutional amendment must be returned for property tax relief. And the majority of that money goes to schools, but there's money goes to municipalities, counties, and there's some direct money, property tax directly to the individual, which we'll also discuss a little bit later. But staying on that, when we talk about the state, which I'm going to get into the budget side in just a minute, we are talking about $82 billion being spent all over by states, municipalities, counties, and school districts. And it does not include federal money. State government, for example, collects about $18 billion of federal aid, principally in programs for healthcare, Medicaid, transportation, things of that nature. It also does not include colleges and universities. They are autonomous entities. In the old days, back when I was budget director, they were part of the state budget. But during the Whitman administration, they have become autonomous. which is common in most states. Now, we have money that goes to them from the state budget, but as an entity, they're not part of this $82 billion that's expended throughout the state. We also have authorities. Individual municipalities and counties have sewage authorities, for example. They're not part of the $82 billion expended. The state has a whole, they have 10 authorities. They're not part of the $82 billion that spent your tax money. For example, the New Jersey Turnpike. Many people think it's part of the state government. It's not. It's a separate authority whose money is coming from the tolls. So it's not part of this 28, 42, 20, and 8, which adds up to $82 billion. So before I wander into the state budget, let me make a couple observations about the governor of the state. Not the present governor, but governors in general. It's generally agreed that the New Jersey governor is the most powerful governor of any governor. And I say that for several reasons. He is the, or she, depending upon the year, is the only statewide elected officer, together with the lieutenant governor. Many states elect the comptroller, state treasurer, the attorney general. Not in New Jersey. It's only the governor who's elected statewide. All cabinet officers are appointed by the governor. Not so in many states. In most states, the attorney general in New York is elected, not appointed by the governor. Constitutional powers related to the budget is incredible. Nobody has greater line item veto power than the New Jersey governor. In addition to numbers in the budget, there's also a lot of directing language, pages of it, that direct how the money is to be spent and other parameters. When that budget comes back to the governor after he has submitted it from the legislature, he can take out anything that they have put in, including parts of languages. There's a Supreme Court case, Kane versus, God, I forgot his name, that says, Governor, you have any power you want with regard to the budget. He appoints all the judges, including the Supreme Court judges across the state. He appoints all 21 prosecutors. He oversees law enforcement in the whole state via the Attorney General. And he has, through the Division of Local Government, broad powers in finance and budget, to the point of view that every budget of the municipality has to be approved by the state. Only one other state has that responsibility, North Carolina. Most states, most municipalities have very little oversight, but not so in New Jersey. Bonds have to be authorized by the state local finance board if it goes over a certain percentage. Let me move on to the second chart there. And what we're going to look at, whoops, that's it. This is the proposed 2021 budget, $41 billion. That's a lot of money. But what should jump out at you when you look at that is where the money's going. State aid, grants and aids, that's 74% of all spending in the state government leaves the state government. It's not spent by the, quote, bureaucrats in Trenton, so to speak. 18 billion, 44% of all money is state aid. It goes back to municipalities, county, school districts. We already mentioned that. We'll pick up it again later. 12 billion is grants and aid. It also leaves the state. So what do we mean by grants and aids? Let me give you an example of 3 or 4. The biggest one, and it's by far the biggest one, is Medicaid. $6.5 billion of state money goes into the Medicaid program. Who's that money paid to? Who's it paid for? Well, to oversimplify it, it's paid for those people who are without health care, below certain poverty levels. And then money winds up in the hands of doctors, nursing homes, hospitals, pharmaceuticals. And in fact, the largest share of Medicaid is nursing home and long-term care costs. Most people think it's for, mothers and children. No, it's for nursing home and long-term care. And in addition to that $6.5 billion of state money, the federal government kicks in another 50%. So we're a matching state, 50-50. We're matching because we're rich. Some states get 75% reimbursement. But for those clients who have just recently joined the Affordable Care Act, the federal government will pay us 90%. So it's a very important key health program of which the state spends a lot of money, but gets assistance from the federal government. $2.5 billion is higher education. It goes back to colleges and universities to help them with their costs, and it's student assistance money. One other chunk of money is a whole plethora of money that goes to nonprofit organizations who run programs on behalf of the state. For example, health programs, mental health programs, programs for the developmentally disabled, programs for youth and family services. State has still overall responsibility, but they've contracted out monies for those programs to be operated. And the third part of the budget, the remaining 26%, is for everything else. State operations, capital, and debt. Let me first mention capital and debt. Of that number, of that $11 billion, $5 billion of it is debt service. The state has about $35 billion worth of bonds that have been approved, and we have to pay debt service on those bonds every year, right? So that's a large part of the budget in the all other section. The remaining amount being about $7 billion, is for what I would call to be the bureaucracy of the state government. It is the 51,000 state employees who work for the state. I should mention that it's a decrease of 10,000 over the last 10 years. You would say, how is that possible? Think about it. We've had prisons closing, we've had mental hospitals closing, we've had centers for the developmentally disabled closing, which reduced the staffing significantly. And where do these people work? Well, by and large, they work in institutions. They staff the prisons, the mental hospitals, the centers for the developmentally disabled, the veterans facilities. Then, of course, we have state troopers, we have motor vehicle folks, et cetera, et cetera. There's also 9,000 folks in the judiciary. And you would say, in the judiciary, with the state government? About 25 years ago, the state took over the costs of all the judicial costs that used to be at the county level to release the burden on the property tax. So those folks are on the state payroll, but the majority of them work out in the counties doing judicial operations. One other point I want to make before I leave the spending is the issue of pensions. It's always an issue when the state budget is prepared. How much are we spending for pensions and for retirement health costs, and is it too much, and what can we do about it? Time doesn't allow me to go into all the details, but there's a couple of facts I want you to understand. That we do have a very poorly funded pension system at the moment. And in this number, $11 billion, there's about $5 billion that's going for pension payments. But a large part of those pension payments are for teachers and the school district. Little known by many folks is that the pension cost that the state pays for is not only for its employees, but also for the retirement costs of the teachers in the school district, and for the retirement health benefits of teachers, and for the matching share of Social Security. If you look in a school district budget, you will not find an appropriation for healthcare, you will not find an appropriation for pensions, and you won't find an appropriation for the Social Security match. That's all picked up by the state government. And it probably leads to such a large number that we have in the state for paying for pensions.
Rich, let me interrupt you. Just one thing to be clear. When you're talking about you won't find health benefit costs,
Marc,
in school budgets, you won't find retiree health benefit costs, correct? But regular health benefit costs of current teachers are in school budgets, are they not?
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that point. Go on.
You can move the chart. I threw this chart in here just to give you a flavor for what I call property tax relief in the budget. And we sort of talked about most of this. Municipal aid, county aid, school district, 15 billion, but it's a big number, 19.4 billion. And we have something I put in there just to remind everybody that there's also direct payment to taxpayers. Think of homestead rebates. Think of the senior freeze. Think of credits that are given on your income tax, like property tax deductions can be part of the direct property tax relief. But I don't want to leave this chart before we look at school aid. It's a big number. It's a very controversial number. And many folks complain about the way the money is distributed. And I don't have time to go into all the details of the formula, but I want to make one point that's important. The money is based upon Supreme Court case decisions that, based upon the wealth of the jurisdiction as determined by the property value and by the income of the people living in that school district, determines the distribution of the state aid. To oversimplify it, if you're in a very poor school district, we'll use Newark as an example, they're going to get a lot more school aid than the district, which is where I live in Plainsboro, West Windsor, which is a relatively wealthy district with high property values and high income. And the money is distributed in order to make sure that everybody gets the equal opportunity to have a thorough and efficient education. Let me switch to the next chart, please. So where does all the money come from to pay for this stuff? Well, the big three there, income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, they represent 73% of all of the revenue in the state. So if something happens in the economy, good, bad, or indifferent, those numbers are going to move up or down depending upon whether it's a good economy or a bad economy. We have a whole bunch of other revenues down there, $10.7 billion. And there's literally 300 different line items in the budget for all these other taxes and fees. Some of the big ones you might be familiar with: alcoholic beverage tax, motor vehicle tax, realty transfer tax, casino tax. You might say, well, where's the lottery? Well, that's a whole other discussion because it's now dedicated to the pension payment. One other number in here I want to call your attention to. If you add up all that income, sales, corporate, other, it comes to $40 billion. But we also have $4.3 billion for the sale of bonds. This year, in the midst of a pandemic, the governor and the legislature decided that they needed to sell bonds to fill in the gap that they thought revenues were going to be decreasing. In fact, as things have turned out, revenues have not decreased, and in fact have increased and are much greater than the governor and the legislature had first anticipated during the problem. But the Supreme Court approved it. I think it was a poor decision. We didn't need the sale of bonds. We now have it. And we now have a grand total of $44.3 billion of revenue in the fiscal 2021 budget. Before we leave that chart, I want to make a point that none of this money includes federal dollars. In the New Jersey way of doing budget, we carry that as an off-budget item. Now, it's all displayed in the budget document. Everybody can follow it, but the budget only reflects what the tax money is paying for. Incidentally, under the act that was just passed by Congress, New Jersey will get $6.5 billion extra money because of the coronavirus. That money is not part of it. At some point between now and July 1st, the governor and the legislature will have to come to grips with what are they going to do with that extra money? Are they going to spend it, or are they going to husband it perhaps and spend it over a period of time? A couple of points about the income tax and the sales tax. In my judgment, they are very progressive. You might say, wait a minute, we've got a 10.75% high rate in New Jersey, but it's for incomes above $1 million. The rest of the tax structure is very progressive. If you compare our tax structure to New York, to Virginia, where I used to live, you will see that it is very progressive. For example, if you make $75,000 in New Jersey, you're going to wind up in the 3.5% tax bracket. If you were in New York, you would be in the 6.5% tax bracket. And if you were in Virginia, everything over $17,000 is taxed at 6%. In the sales tax component, again, a big number, but there's a lot of things exempted from the sales tax. We don't pay for food and clothing. When I used to live in Virginia, food and clothing was taxed. So Keevey concludes that while we tax a lot, And lots of people are upset about the size of the income tax and the sales tax. I would say it's a pretty progressive tax structure. Next chart, please. Next chart. Back one, please. All right, before I turn over the discussion to Mark, who's going to fill you in about property taxes and all things municipal, I just have two charts just to give you a flavor for what's coming. So what is the total property tax levy in New Jersey? What is this onerous tax that we think about? Well, it's $30.8 billion. And as you can remember from my prior discussion, it is the biggest single tax in New Jersey. It's almost twice the size of the income tax. And you can see that the majority of it's for schools, 16.2 billion of the 30.8. Municipal is 9.1 billion and county $5.5 billion. Last chart. And I promised Mark, I'd get off in 20 minutes, and I'm almost there. I hear my buzzer. Here's a lead in. So where does the money come from the municipal side? Well, again, it's pretty clear. The property tax is 8.8 billion of the 14.7 of municipal revenue throughout the entire state. So the majority of expenditures at the local level comes and supported by the property tax. Next biggest one is a whole range of miscellaneous revenues. If you go speeding through a town, the trooper pulls you over or the local cop pulls you over, you're going to get a ticket. That goes into the miscellaneous revenues. The state kicks in $1.6 billion. And all property tax rates is not the same, right? Depends upon, or the impact of the property tax is not the same with everybody. It depends upon the assessed property of your house. It depends upon the municipal and school district budgets. So property tax is very different depending upon where you live. And it's a function of the assessment and the spending side of it and the rate that's struck by the local governing body and the county. So let me stop here. Wanted to make sure you understood from the state government point of view where the money is going, and to remind everybody that the entities that spend all your money, that spend your, what I've mentioned in the beginning, over $80 billion of tax money is basically at the state and local level. Okay, Mark, you're up.
Hey, Donna, can you please unmute Mark?
There we go. Hello. Sorry about that. I wound up having to mute myself and it wouldn't let me back in. Good evening, everybody. That was my voice you heard to ask Rich a question about school healthcare before. I'm very happy to be here. I have been around, as Carmel had introduced me, for a long time in Jersey. I'm familiar with Montclair, visited many times. And I am really happy to be here to help you understand the challenges of New Jersey and our property taxes and all our local governments. I do have a lot to talk about. I'm going to go at a quick pace. So if you've got some questions, hopefully I will answer them as before I am done. But after that, please make sure you put your questions in chat. And I guess Ron or Peter is going to be able to wrangle those so we can answer them when I'm done with my presentation. So we're going to take off now. When it comes to New Jersey property taxes and local governments and schools, there's a couple key points that I want to highlight. One is there's a phrase from evolutionary biology that we found, which I think really explains a lot of how New Jersey local government works, is that everything is the way it is because it got that way. And I know that sounds a little trite and a little glib, but it's basically a function of evolution. We started New Jersey local governments back in the late 1700s. And it has been an evolutionary process since. We've had constitutional changes. They kind of maybe jumped evolution a little bit. But what we have seen is because things were the way they were, there was a problem and we tried to solve it. Right? And periodically, when things get really bad, we try to solve things a different way or we try to change things. But as things go, they get more and more solidified and things get harder to change because we get locked in. That is one of the root causes of the challenges that we have. And as I said, we started our municipalities in the late 1700s, and it was shortly thereafter that people started complaining about property taxes. You can go back and look in New Jersey history books. There's some great volumes that talk about the state from the 1870s through up into around the 1920s. And property taxes were always something that everybody complained about. Our current system really started after the state constitution was redone in the late 40s. But New Jersey homeowners have always complained about property taxes. And you would think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, that if we knew how to solve it, we would have figured it out already. So it is a challenge that has been with us for generations now. Another big picture driver is the New Jersey subdivision state, which is how our municipalities and schools developed. And the short version of this is that we started in around 1798 with about 102 municipalities. Most of those were townships. The rest were some incorporated towns and cities such as Newark and Elizabeth and Patterson. But over that time, that evolutionary process that I discussed is we started subdividing and subdividing and subdividing. So, we had large townships. For example, a place I used to work up in Bergen County called the Pascack Valley. Around 1870, it was one municipality called Washington Township. But during the next 40 years, when we had this fascination of creating boroughs from large townships, because folks in those town centers in those communities wanted to control their own schools, and the farmers that surrounded those little villages didn't want to have to pay for schools and things like sidewalks. So those boroughs incorporated on their own so they could have their own school district, right? So that one township, which was at 1.33 square miles, is now 10 municipalities. And that original township was all that's left is about 3 square miles. But that happened throughout the state, up in Bergen County, in Morris County, Passaic County, down in Camden County, Atlantic County, Middlesex County, Mercer County. This is how we got to where we are today. But it is a process that started literally from the time that we became a state in colonial days. And we also have what I call the challenge of density and the mythology of the many. And that brings us to the question of, why does New Jersey have 565 municipalities again? And what's the problem with that? And it seems like we have a lot. So as I said, it came from this evolution that we had. But compared to other states, yes, we all know that New Jersey has more municipalities per square mile than any other state. And that is often raised as a reason why don't we can start consolidating our municipalities together, and because we're sure to save some money when we do that. Well, a colleague of mine at Rutgers, back around 2013, 14, we decided to take a look at this, does this work? So we did a little study. And some of the things that we discovered from that study is that New Jersey is also the most densely populated state in the country. And we think that density is a more important marker here than per square mile. So, for example, we are 20% more densely settled than the second most densely populated state, which is Rhode Island, and we're 40% more densely settled than number 3, which is Massachusetts. That means a lot in New Jersey. We cram a lot of people into a small state, and when you think about the fact that, depending on how you count it, 20 to 25% of the state will never be intensely developed because it's pine lands, it's farmland. You can count part of the highlands in there. You've got the mountain regions in Hunterdon and Warren County and up into Sussex. We're cramming all those people into really 75% of the state, which means that New Jersey has 9 of the 20 most densely populated municipalities in the country. All right, that's a lot. We own the top 4. Now, I could do a guess. When I do presentation like this, I kind of make the audience try to guess who are the top 4. All right. And some of you are probably trying to think about it and what they are. I'll tell you the answers. It's Guttenberg, which is actually the most highly populated, which is in Hudson County. They're all in Hudson County. It's Gothenburg, it's Union City, it's West New York, and I forgot the other one. I think it's Hoboken. All right, but they're in the top four, right? And there are a lot of other Hudson County, but places like Passaic are in the top 9. Irvington, I think, is in the top 9, is in that top 20. And as it says up here, we have 27 of the top 100. So it's not just Hudson County where we're densely populated. All right, that's a remarkable thing. That one state has over 1/4 of the most densely populated municipalities in the country. And there's another interesting figure that we discovered, is that when you look at the number of municipalities per capita, we're only 34th in the country. So when you look at the number of people who we cram into individual municipalities, we're on the low side. And we're also 15th in population per municipality at roughly 15,000. Right? So while, yes, we have a lot of municipalities in a small state, but when you look at how many people those municipalities represent and issues of local democracy and representation, right? We're nowhere near at the top. Right? And that has implications for how we govern. And one small factor, because people says, well, we've got all these school districts now, and we have all these local authorities. Yeah, we have a lot of those. We got, depending on how you count, between 590 and 650 school districts and boards of education, depending on how you count charters. Charters get you to that other upper number. But even when you look at schools and local authorities and special purpose districts that do property taxing, we're only 40th in the country, because most states have a lot of special taxing districts, right? Where they have a park districts where they charge for parks. They'll have other types of special districts that can do property taxing as well. We have fire districts in schools, and that's pretty much it. So superficially, it sounds like, yes, we've got too many, but in the reality, that number isn't as absurd as it sounds when you look at all the different challenges. And I would also suggest that density is a much larger problem, because it drives a whole lot of other issues in the state. And I think we'll come back to that in a couple minutes. So with all this, we also talk about property taxes. And there's a common complaint that property taxes are too high. Right? And I'm sure in Montclair, most of you will argue that your property taxes are too high. But what does that mean? Is that a visceral reaction to that property tax bill that you get? Right? But so what are those implications? Because there's a couple ways you can measure property tax burden. Are the rates too high? That's the rate that we, the dollars and cents that we charge per $100 of assessed value. And if so, what is too high? What is low? What's just right? Do you compare state or county averages? Because we're a very diverse state, as you'll see in another slide. That range of average taxes on a county level, it runs at a really different level. It's not the same. What's your measure? Do we look at the average tax bill? Look at the average residential tax bill. That's a standard marker that the Division of Local Government Services use, and a lot of press reports covered that there's this average. Take the average residential value, and you calculate the property taxes on it as the marker that we compare from year to year within towns. The tax levy, that's how much your government spends. How much the government raises in property taxes. Do you look at total spending? Those are very different numbers. Do we look at the rate? Do we look at the percent of household income used for property taxes as a measure of tax burden? That would seem to be a logical number to use, because that could say, well, that burden on that household is too high because it is at X percent higher than what the average is, and that might be a good marker to use as well. It's a measure of affordability at that point. Is it a localized problem or statewide? Is it urban, suburban, or rural, depending on where you're complaining? Is it people say, well, my taxes are too high for the services I get or don't get? Right? And as you saw from Rich, you saw that breakdown of spending, where you see schools are in the 50s, municipalities in the 20s, and counties below that. So if you say, well, I'm paying so much, almost 60% of that for schools, what value does that have? That gets you to the trade-offs. Now, how do you solve that problem? Right? And we'll talk more about that. Oh yeah, and who are we comparing ourselves to, and who's actually complaining? Because I can tell you where I live in Somerset County, right? I'm not complaining about my property taxes. I have a townhouse in a condo development. I pay about $8,000 a year, just about below the state average, but it's the lowest in Somerset County, right? And I know some of you would like kill to pay that much in property taxes in Montclair, right? But it's just very different. So this chart, a little hard to read. I'll try to show you what it looks like here. But these are the counties run from lowest average property tax to the highest, and the little line graph here is the percent of taxes as a percentage of household income. So clearly Essex is at the top. It's the highest percentage of average it's got the highest average property tax, and these numbers are 2016, which is the last time I calculated this, but over time they don't change all that much. And the percent of household income is at the highest. Now, part of the challenge with that is that Essex County also has a lot of renters. That's the same with Bergen and Union County as well. But then you look at the far left-hand side, taxes they're pretty modest. All right, the percentage of household income reasonably modest, and it's actually a pretty flat number. Right, it just gets higher once we get past Somerset and we hit Passaic, and then Morris drops, and Union goes up, and Bergen drops a little, and then Essex is at the top. So it's hard to figure out what exactly the problem is, so you can get your arms around trying to figure out what some solutions to it might be. There's a couple other big picture drivers. Along with density, we have aging infrastructure. Because we were one of the first states to develop as an urban state, we have our urban infrastructure, which is older than anybody else's in the country. All right, New York City's got old stuff, but when you look at a region, we've got the oldest stuff around. We still have some brick water lines in Newark, right? And we still have combined sewer and stormwater systems that overflow. And we have cities on the Hudson River that need to fix that because of the pollution that they cause. We have lead in the water systems throughout virtually all of our urban areas, and Newark is doing a great job of trying to clean that up there. And other cities are trying to learn from what they've done to get rid of lead in the water issues. But even when you get into the suburbs that were starting to develop in the 1920s and 30s, those train stops along what we used to fondly call the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad, right? They're all having older infrastructure in their downtowns that they have to start to deal with. And that's water, that's sewer, that's also roads, that's sidewalks. It's in older neighborhoods where the sidewalks that were put in 60 years ago are starting to finally deteriorate and need to be replaced, right? All of those things add to the cost of doing business. And the fact that we're so densely populated adds to the cost of fixing those things, because you're stopping traffic. You have to work at night because you can't stop traffic all the time. Going in and replacing infrastructure in a built-up area is a lot more expensive than it is building new infrastructure out in farmland. So that's a thing that adds cost to us. More controversial, the impact of organized labor in our political system. All right. First, let me make a personal observation about my own thinking. Right, so whatever bias I may have is that I think labor unions, public sector labor unions, are very important to our system, because I have seen how the political system can take advantage of public employees, and labor unions are a good way of protecting employees from that type of behavior. Not everybody does it, but there's enough that we need something like that. However, it's important to point out that public sector unions, and I'm speaking across the country now, are the only labor organization. It's the only part of the economy where employees can play a significant role in determining who their bosses are. And that has significance. right? When you have labor unions who can play an outsized role in determining who gets elected to office, right? In our political system, there's expectations that unions or anybody who helps contribute to get people elected, right, is going to expect something in return. So when you're at the negotiating table, trying to negotiate on behalf of taxpayers as well, there's compromises there. Right? And that is a problem. And I'm not sure how we solve that, frankly, but it is an issue. Right? And it has a serious impact on the costs of doing local government in New Jersey, when many budgets, up to roughly, I haven't done a calculation recently on it, but it used to be around 70% of a municipal or school budget goes towards paying labor and labor-related expenses. Right? Small numbers above that, small little numbers of services and utilities, your utility costs, capital improvement costs, day-to-day operating costs, rent, things like that. Small numbers, marginal savings there. The real costs are in the cost of employees. Right? And in many of the things that we do in government, we are very labor intensive. Schools, public safety, all have a significant labor component. Public works. And even if you contract stuff out, you're still dealing with cost of employees of the contractor. Right? And they may be able to have a lower wage profile, but we're still going to add in profit and taxes that government doesn't have to pay. So it's a huge challenge. The political dynamics of the state, I'm not going to get political on this, but we know New Jersey has a history of political machines being, running and being responsible for a lot of government decisions. It is of particular interest right now, where we have a relatively young progressive movement that is challenging the machines. It is the nature of our beast. It is our political DNA, essentially. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, but it is something we have. And as mentioned before, on the impact of organized labor in the political system, you have a connection that mitigates against some significant public interest elements of how you keep public costs down. And it's clear that, that organized labor in New Jersey has been very effective in having contracts that give their employees a good middle class livelihood. And that's all to our credit, because that's spending, that's economic growth, that's more money in the economy. But it has an impact. And how we balance those things is a really difficult challenge that we sometimes do well and sometimes we don't do so well. But that's the challenge we have. And those political dynamics, to go back to something that Rich talked about, that political dynamics is the thing that said, well, in the late 90s and early 2000s, state government decided to stop making payments into the public employee pension system, which has led us to the problems we have today, that a significant part of our state budget is going toward paying back money into the pension system, the contributions we should have made to ensure that the pension system remains solvent. Right? And that's an interesting challenge by itself. So there's some paradoxes about this as well. So we talk about, yes, we have the highest property taxes in the country, but our service level is high. Our educational outcomes are always in the top 2 or 3 compared to our peer states, right? And we have location. We talk about this, and it's really an important and vital element that we have from an economic and desirable place to live, one of the best places in the country, located between New York Metro and Philly Metro. I mean, those of us in New Jersey don't really think about the Philly Metro area all that much, but it's important to people who live down in Camden and Burlington and Gloucester and Atlantic counties, as it is to us up here in Essex, Bergen, Passaic, Morris County, Somerset, Middlesex. It's just as important. Right? And a nice hunk of the people live there. So we live in a good place. And we expect, and because of what we pay in taxes, we expect a reasonably good level of public services. And we usually get that. It's become our expectation over time. And I also point out that property taxes are just one element of the cost of living. A recent study from insure.com pointed out that New Jersey has the 14th highest cost of living in the country. Right? Their numbers look reliable to me. There's all kinds of methodologies you can use to calculate cost of living and equalizing it. But this is just one sample study that looked good to me. And I said, okay, well, New Jersey's number 14. It kind of surprised me, actually. But there you go. Compared to other, we think it's a lot here, but compared to other places, maybe not so much. Because other places have different tax structures. They have more nuisance taxes. You get payroll taxes. You get other things that go into it, personal property taxes that you wind up paying on an annual basis. Like down in where Rich used to live, I think in Virginia, you pay an annual vehicle tax. It's part of personal property. We don't do that here. And as Rich also pointed out, our tax structure is progressive in that the more money you earn, the higher percentage of income that you pay in taxes as compared to the low end. So if you consider social equity issues, yeah, we're pretty high on that scale too. Quality of life surveys. This is really interesting. My friends at Monmouth polled that at Monmouth University show upwards often, and it varies from year to year based on the economy, but roughly in the mid to high 60s and sometimes low 70s, people think that New Jersey is an excellent or good place to live. Those are statewide polls, right? But if people are really complaining about property taxes or think that property taxes are so horrible, they also say that this is a really good place to live. So those are interesting challenges there. All right. And I'm not saying, anybody's right or wrong here, but when you try to think about what solutions might be, you run into these paradoxes. And finally, as I mentioned before, labor and related costs is the single biggest budget item in local governments and school budgets. So cutting becomes difficult. Right? What do you not want to do? You're making decisions about what do you not want to do. Or you say, well, we're just going to lay off public employees and we'll stop doing these services. Well, what services are you going to stop doing? And what are the recipients of those services going to say to the elected officials who are talking about cutting them? And how do they respond to that? Right? There are expenses we can cut. We'll talk in a few minutes about shared services. There are things you can do, but they're not easy to do. They can be challenging. And the savings can accrue over time, but more than anything, they prevent taxes from going up as fast as they otherwise would. So we talked about consolidation a little bit. Can we consolidate our way? And that 2014 study that we did on per capita costs of municipalities showed some interesting things. So what Dr. Ray Caprio and I did, we looked at per capita costs of municipalities. We made some adjustments. We took out resort communities to try to equalize things as reasonably as we could do. And it's a partial. It's a reasonably good number. But we found that per capita costs run from a low of 1,092 people in the second population bracket of municipalities between 3,600 and 5,150 in population, to a high of 1,340 per capita for people in 40,000 to 277,000, which is Newark in that case, right? Montclair, you're just below the 40,000 number, which is actually one of the sweet spots in the $1,200 range per capita to pay for municipal services. And just municipal, it's not school, right? That's not a huge spread, right? And if you're paying $15,000 in property taxes, right? One of the questions you would ask, well, is it worth 200, I'm a household of 4 people. Is that worth the savings to have to merge with another municipality? All right. So those are interesting public questions there. The tendency we found is that smaller places spend less per capita. Again, that may be contradictory because what about economies of scale? Well, we also learned that in smaller places, you rely more on volunteers. Smaller places tend to be, and no one data point, no one analysis point was statistically significant that it could represent the whole. We have lots of little smaller things along the way, but smaller places tend to focus more on economy and keeping costs down, and larger places tend to think more about providing more services to people. Larger places tend to have more heterogeneous populations, which drives the need for more and diverse services to serve different populations. And smaller places tend to be more homogeneous in population, where people are pretty much in the same brackets and have the same expectations for services. So they can focus on smaller things. We also know that the larger organizations get, the higher the salaries, because you have more employees. Public employee unions get involved in local politics, and there's more people to be able to do that and try to influence the behavior of elected officials. So larger group numbers of employees effectively translates to higher costs for employees. And we see that significantly in the school area, where generally speaking, districts with more teachers tend to have higher salary ranges than districts with fewer teachers. So, and when you consolidate either a school district or a municipality, the expectation is, and it's a hard one, you may want to beat it, but it's very hard to beat, that salaries will go down. Right? And those are very difficult political challenges to solve when you're trying to negotiate with employee labor unions and match public expectations. We went through that in the Princetons, our single consolidation, all right, over the last almost 70 years now, I guess, right? Those were two very similar municipalities, similar populations. They had a lot of things going for them from a financial standpoint that aligned them. They had the same police local that represented police officers. And they were able to make it work and not increase anybody's taxes because of consolidation itself. And there were some very fluky things that went to that. And it was really a one-off, because if you notice, we haven't had any more. We didn't have any consolidations before then, and we haven't had any serious discussion of it since then. I want to keep moving here now. So I said there's no one variable out of 50 we tested that significantly explains those differences. The closest, by the way, is wealth. Is that the more property wealth the municipality had on a per capita basis, the more money they would spend. So that's the one big thing that was the most statistically significant element of the 50 things that we tested. We also did some consolidation modeling. And if we estimated that we could save 5% in expenses, that would result in less than a $75 average residential savings, looking at what then was a $7,500, not average value, but average taxes. That's what you could save, right? If you save 75, if you're able to save just 5% in expenses, which is kind of tough to do. So that's consolidation. Some technical issues. I've taken to telling people, and I think Rich has agreed with me, that in a government, spending increases to meet the amount of available revenue. So if we want to try to deal with that, we want to maybe look at the laws that permit government agencies, local governments and schools to spend more because they bring in more money through additional development, right? If more money comes in, be it through increased values, which produce increased taxes without having to raise the rate, or if we're doing redevelopment projects that bring in pilot revenues, how do we spend that money? Well, do you have to spend it in the first place? Those are tough decisions for governing bodies. Keeping assessments at their current market value, which some municipalities do, not a lot, but that has value in ensuring tax equity. We have a paradox of seniors and spending increases. Remember how I said earlier that our tax system was pretty much based on the world of the late 40s? Well, how many people were living into their 80s and 90s on their own in the 40s and 50s? You really can't, it's a small number, because longevity was a lot less back then. Well, our system was based on when you paid property taxes because you were working. When you retired around in the mid 60s, you were maybe only active for another couple years. You may have been living with your kids. You may have moved to Florida. But now since we've improved lifespan, people are living longer. They live in their own home, or they buy in a senior development, but they're paying taxes at the full rate. That provided an extra boost. That provides the government system an extra boost of revenues. All right. But the system was based on people who had income, and their income could afford to pay the property taxes. But now we have a whole cluster of people who don't have income, who are in retirement, but still paying the full freight on property taxes. That's an interesting proposition that we haven't done any studies yet, but I think it's an area that we really ought to be looking at. And I say that not as a newly minted senior citizen, because I said before I'm okay with my taxes. Ideas such as dual tax rates, or a lower rate on improvements and a higher rate on land, that would encourage more effective and more efficient, economically efficient land use development. We ought to be looking at that, and our redevelopment laws, I would argue, also need a thing. And we really should do a comprehensive study of our property tax system, because again, it is 70, 80, and in some parts 150 years old. And maybe we ought to figure out what a 21st century property tax system ought to look like. In the questions that you asked us in advance, you talked about state reforms to pension and post-retirement health insurance costs. Yes, we need those. Rich and I were both on a committee set up by the state legislature that recommended that we need to do those things. We've had some activity on the health benefit side, but we really need to spend time dealing with those things, because they can help at the state level in particular and reduce those costs and try to bend that pension cost curve. Shared services, it's been around for decades. Our first laws encouraging shared services between municipalities and schools was passed in the mid-1970s. Montclair has taken advantage of those over the years. You were the first and regrettably only municipality, I think, that was ever basically to share services with the neighbor for its paid fire services with your arrangement with Glen Ridge. Challenges in doing shared services. You need a willing buyer and seller, municipality who wants to buy services and another municipality who wants to sell them the services they want to buy, who trust each other, and you have consistent political leadership on both sides. Because what you don't want to do is enter into a shared services agreement, and if you're buying it from a municipality who 2 years later has a change in governing body status, and all of a sudden the new people are saying, well, why are we spending our time selling stuff to Montclair? It's taking away the time and attention we should spend on our own citizens. Or you decide, hey, wait a minute, this is a good deal. Let's see if we can increase the rates or go back to renegotiate, because they got rid of all the garbage trucks that they had. And now we're providing solid waste collection services. So now we're going to up the rate, and they can't do much about it. That sounds nasty by the one governing body partner, but circumstances change and people have attitude to differences. The timing and motivation on both sides is important. Going into an election season and trying to do these things is hard to do. And you also asked about regional policing. That is a very difficult concept to do. We've had one real success of that down in Camden County with the city of Camden, and people will argue about whether that was successful or not. I think it was, from a cost-saving standpoint and the ability to manage the police department. But policing is one of the things that's most central to what people think is important about their town. Police services, land use, zoning, those are the things I think that most people think about as the most important services that a town provides. And turning that over to somebody else, people can have a lot of reticence about doing that. Though said, we do have a number of small municipalities that are very successful, either merged their police department or gone into contracts because the timing worked, the motivation worked, and there was trust on all sides. Somebody asked about eliminating counties. Well, we have to remember that counties were originally established as the arms of state services, that they basically were the local state office for dealing with things like welfare, elections, jails, courts. Over the years, they've accreted more services. Some counties decide to do a lot of discretionary services that they don't have to do, but they do it because they can or they choose to. Some people have also, I'm not sure how you get rid of them, because that will increase the state bureaucracy. And it will also, or push more responsibility down onto municipalities who may or may not have the capacity to manage those things. And some wags have also suggested, well, instead of eliminating counties, why don't we just consolidate all municipal governments and let counties run them? All right. 6 of one, half a dozen of another on that debate. Nobody really knows, but we do know that when you make government larger, your expenses tend to go up, although we think there's probably at some point you might get economies of scale, but I'm not quite sure where. Somebody asked about allocation between New Jersey and New York of income earned by interstate commuters, and I'm going to ask Rich if you can jump in on this and briefly explain what that debate is all about.
Well, currently, if you live in New Jersey and work in New York, you pay New York taxes. That total amount, incidentally, is about $4.5 billion that one might argue could be in New Jersey. And recently, of course, because of the virus, a lot of people who used to go into New York and work now work from home. So the issue and the question to be solved is we need to rethink about how we divide up the taxes between New York and New Jersey based upon where somebody is now working. This seems obvious to some people. Well, if you don't live in, or if you don't work in New York anymore, what are you paying New York taxes for? But obviously, New York will not be a willing changer in this. So there is no easy answer to it. We're going to have legislation. It might even involve a federal decision involved. But it's one of the larger, what I would call tax expenditures. Tax code in New Jersey is filled with exemptions, credits, and deductions, about $30.5 billion, of which 4.5 is this money that we pay our workers who work in New York, pay it to the New York government. So I think it's something that's going to be looked at very carefully. Maybe now's the time to strike against New York when they may be having a little bit of shaky leadership, but certainly something to be looked at.
So, Rich, that also leads to the issue of state tax breaks and what we call tax expenditures, which is where the state provides tax credits to individuals and businesses by not taxing certain things that would otherwise be taxed. And we call those tax expenditures, and we've got about $32 billion of those. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how people can learn about them?
Well, I think that's the number I mentioned, about $32 billion. It changes every year depending upon the credits and deductions. But in the tax code, there's lots of deductions and credits. Corporations have credits and deductions. Individuals have credits and deductions. The sales tax law has credits and deductions. Theoretically, or maybe practically, if you taxed food and clothing in this state, you would generate $3.5 billion. Now, there's obviously pros and cons to that. People would say, what are we doing that for? It's not progressive. Actually, you could make it progressive. You could give folks a credit or a deduction on their income tax below a certain income. You might say, nobody does that. And I would say to you, well, when I lived in Virginia, we taxed food and clothing. In fact, depending upon where you ate in Virginia, you could pay 5% sales tax, 7% or 8%, because the municipality had a sales tax on food, the county has a tax on food. Suffice to say, in any kind of tax reform that the state should enter into, and I would advocate that they do so, look at all these credits and deductions. Now, this is just a very personal view. As a veteran, I get all kinds of deductions. But my property tax and my income tax, I don't need that deduction. I was 2 years in the Army. When I came out of the Army, they gave me money to go to graduate school. They gave me a loan to buy my house. I don't need any money. But other veterans would say, oh, I need to be rewarded for what I do. Anyway, then all these credits and deductions sprinkled through the tax code that need to be carefully looked at. We may have to do that soon if, in fact, our expenditures continue to rise and our revenue is steady. But I would argue needs to be looked at.
So if you want to learn more about that, if you do a web search for New Jersey Tax Expenditure Report, the Department of Treasury, the Office of Revenue and Economic Analysis, every year does a tax expenditure report that shows basically for each of the things, each of the policies we have, how much is accountable to it. So if that's something you want to dig into, you can find that via a web search. To wrap this up, any changes to all of these challenges, and I've just touched superficially on a number of them, and we could talk for hours on this, but we're not going to tonight. Changes need to come through the political process, and that involves, that's the give and take, and that's you take something away. There's some group that wants that and takes advantage of it and says, wait, that's ours, take it away from somebody else. It's that old colonial line, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. Engage your elected officials, and these are all League of Women Voter, basically basic things that drive the league. Start local at the grassroots. That's where change comes from. In your elected officials that move up into the system, that become county people, that become assembly members and Senate members. That's where change happens. And engage in the democratic and political processes.
Right.
So that is my spiel. Oh, wait, Carmel, one more thing. For those of you that want to know more about how the property tax system works, all right, and how where your tax bill comes from, how it's calculated, assessment process. I worked with the CPA Society and NJ Realtors and Municipal Assessors a couple years ago. If you do a search for New Jersey Property Tax Guide, you will get this Homeowner's Guide to Property Taxes. It's the only thing of its type out there. And I will tell you, it's very informative and very easy to read. On that note.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really appreciate both you and Richard's presentation. I was so wrapped up in what you were saying, I kind of lost track of the time and should have given you a 5-minute warning to move along. But anyway, we do still want to answer questions. So I'm going to turn this over to Peter Brawley. And if he has some questions that have come in the chat room, please, Peter, let's ask a few until people get tired and start drifting away.
and Rich and I will attempt to be very pithy and brief in our answers and try not to get carried away with them.
Very good. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions, and some recent ones are regarding pilots, which is payment in lieu of taxes. Joyce Rudin asked, what is the impact of towns granting pilots to developers? Does this add to our tax burden, and is it good or bad for our community? And Clemens also asks, how do pilots impact money for town services and the school budget?
Okay, so I'll take a crack at that. The reason you may want that towns do pilots is because you have a redevelopment program to redevelop lands that are, as we say, in need of redevelopment, or because we don't like the term blighted. That those properties can get special benefits under the Constitution. So the legislature's created laws that permit a municipality to negotiate a payment in lieu of taxes or an annual service fee, and they are exempt from school, municipal, and county taxes. Historically, that power was only available to urban municipalities, that what we used to call the Abbott school districts. And in those cases, the state was paying for all school increases. We changed the law in 1992. Any municipality that has an area in need of redevelopment can do this. Town enters into the agreement. It technically keeps all the revenue, and there's a formula in the law that says here's what you have to base it on. 5% of it now on new ones has to go to the county government, but the municipality keeps the rest of the money, which was based on the total tax rate, including schools as well as municipal in the county. The municipality has the authority to bring that into its budget as a revenue. It is exempt from the levy cap and spending caps that we have. So it's basically new money that can be spent. Similar to what if there's a new development, that new development comes in and pays municipal taxes, the municipality gets that as an add-on and can spend that as well. The decisions of whether they're good or bad is a municipal by municipal choice. There is no right or wrong answer to that. It's all how badly you want that redevelopment project and what the redeveloper says they need, and the diligence you do to examine the financial case that the developer is making to be able to achieve that goal.
Okay,
right?
that was not so pithy.
Yeah, but it covers it.
Okay, next question, Peter.
Okay, there are questions, a few questions about schools. One question came in from Eric D'Amato, and essentially he's noting that there's a vote coming up soon, or a discussion coming up soon, to determine whether or not our school district will be changed from an appointed model to an elected model, bringing it into line with 98% of other municipalities. The question is whether there's any evidence that one or the other is beneficial financially. And I know we talked about this in committee, so I'll let you speak, but I'll also point out that following this and recapping this event on the League of Women Voters website, the League has done an extensive study on the subject, and we'll have that available for people who are interested in looking at more detail on that.
So my answer is I'm not aware of any studies that have done that type of a comparison. And if you guys have done one, I'm going to be really interested in seeing the results of it.
Yes, our study was done in 2009, and it was weighed in on the side of having an appointed school board, and that is on our website.
Okay, I'll take a look for that. Thank you.
My only 2 cents is that I actually served on the school board for 9 years in the town where we raised our children. I was the board president for 8 years. Nobody else wanted to do it. They said, keep doing it, Rich. And the only thing that brought out people were if you were going to move the kids from the 5th grade to the middle school, it was like you were going to move them into a bunch of tyrants. And of course, the second big thing that would draw people out was you were going to close a school building, both of which we entertained, did one, but not the other.
So Rick, was it an elected school board that you were on, or was it an appointed?
Elected. I like elected school board.
Okay.
And we made sure that we kept 1,000 feet away from the municipal governing body. We were only worried about the school district.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Okay, this is just perhaps to review quickly the shared services agreement. Montclair currently has a shared services agreement with Glen Ridge for fire, Cedar Grove and Verona for health, and with Nutley for nursing services in various amounts. It seems to be something that Montclair has embraced, but Bob Russo, who was involved in those early discussions with other towns, is asking why haven't more towns adopted those things, the shared services agreements, or expanded that?
I'll go back. I can go back and show you the slide with the kind of challenges that I raised on that. It's almost a market-based consideration. Some towns don't think it's worth the effort. Some towns guard their prerogative that they feel they want or need control over a particular service. We are seeing a flurry right now of municipal courts, of municipalities sharing municipal court services. That seems to be one of the most trendy things happening, because a lot of municipalities may not look at their courts as the most vital thing that they have control over. And of course, because it's the courts, they have limited control over it. But there seems to be a trend of that happening. But it's a tough thing to do because the timing, the service, the economics, the sense of control, the willing buyer and seller thing is a real interesting challenge to come up with.
Thank you, Mark. Let's do the next question, please.
Okay. There's something about assessments. How do towns determine? Whoops, the chat just switched. Okay. How do towns determine the tax rate in each town, and why would Montclair's rate be higher than others' towns? That's from John Sullivan. There was another related question. Ann Forstenzer asks, as a homeowner in Montclair, is there a way to find out what percentage of property tax challenges have been successful in reducing taxes?
Okay, on the first one, it's a simple, the formula is simple math. The municipal budget, school budget, will basically have a bottom number of the amount to be raised in taxes. They take all the school or the municipality adds up all its expenses, they deduct their other revenues from it, and the number that's left over is the tax levy. There's some state laws that limit those things, and that's part of the budget making process. That levy, all right, is basically put in a fraction where it becomes the bottom top number rather of a formula, which involves the total assessed value. And you do the math on that and you get a rate per $100 of assessed value, all of which is finely detailed in nice, easy graphics in the New Jersey Homeowner's Guide to Property Taxes.
Thank you. I think
go look at that.
We'll take two more questions because it is getting late and people are dropping off.
All right, Greg Mealy, the administrative side of the public school system seems bloated / costly. How are there, well, let me rephrase it a little bit. Are there places that you've seen where people have been able to reduce the layers or reduce costs? And I'll extend that. Perhaps something that we also talked about, have you ever seen examples where where other states or municipalities have consolidated school districts in order to perhaps eliminate some of those layers and some of the excess?
Go ahead, Rich. Let me make an observation about that. I don't know the direct answer to what's being asked by the individual, and I don't think anybody has that. But under a recent study that was done, Marc referred to it, that Senator Sweeney led, a major recommendation was to merge all these K through 4, K through 5, K through 8, K through 9 into regional school districts. Not only would it reduce costs, but it would significantly improve educational training. Think about different school districts with different alignment, sending all the kids to the same high school, coming from different backgrounds in terms of what was taught. Most people would argue that's not the way to educate kids. So I think that's a really, really good recommendation, to get rid of these small school districts and make them into a regional district. Another recommendation that was made as part of that review was the issue of special education. Depending upon what school district you are in, it tracks families and folks who have children with special needs. And it tilts the costs within certain school districts because they have to provide these services. So a recommendation would be to take that out of the school district budget and have the state fully finance special education. So there's a couple thoughts there. Most people, at least from my experience as a board member, hesitate to regionalize with anybody. We tried it a couple times, and the principal argument that we got from surrounding school districts, well, we've had our football team for 20 years and you're going to take it away. So there's all kinds of irrational reasons not to do things that make sense pedagogically and fiscally.
Thank you. So one more question, Peter, our last hurrah.
Okay, this is a simple one, but I'll also point out several people have posted links and requests to further conversations. So please take a look through the chat and have a look at what other people have posted. It's something I think we'll also want to continue to have conversations on in the recap for this on the League of Women Voters site. The last one is simply from Lynn Cooney. There was a limit on how much the property taxes could go up per year. Has that expired? And if so, what have the yearly increases been?
So there were two. There's a law about how much municipalities can appropriate each year that limits that right now to, I think it's about 3% or the cost of living, whichever is lower, and we're at a lower level of that. That's appropriation. That's how much they spend, but that's subject to a number of exceptions, and every municipality is still obligated to meet those requirements. The other law is an increase in tax levy, which is capped at 3% a year. That is still in effect. That is every municipality and schools and fire district, everybody, all local units are required to meet that standard, and they do. There are exceptions to that as well. And one of the big exceptions, as I mentioned earlier, is increases in assessed value or new pilot revenue that comes in. That is allowed to be spent on top of that increase that you're allowed to do under the 3% rule. From 2010 to, I guess, 2016 or 17, the Christie administration had passed and renewed a law that's now expired that put a cap on public safety contract settlements, that put a 3% limit on how much police and fire salaries could go up on an annual year. And that was this total spend value of salaries in a police contract could go up on an annual basis. That has expired. that really did do a good job of controlling expenses during those periods. But the legislature has not seen fit to reenact that.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm such a nerd, of course, I could talk about this stuff all night, but I really do think our time is up. Thanks to our two terrific presenters for joining us tonight, and to Peter Brawley, Donna Ward, Ron Pate, and our behind-the-scenes help, Ann Moore and Susan Mack, for getting this event together. Clearly, I think we've sparked a discussion here on a very interesting topic to a lot of people, which is great. But I think our discussion also has shown that the problems associated with lowering property taxes in New Jersey appear to be pretty intractable. Neither Republican nor Democratic administrations have been able to materially change property tax levels or how the revenue flows to state, counties, or municipalities. The only way to effect change is for voters to have the political will to force hard choices on politicians. This requires a fact-based, non-ideological approach to the discussion, like we've had tonight. I just want to leave you with the mission of the League of Women Voters, which advocates for grassroots engagement on political issues and encourages participation by all citizens in the political process. Take action, join the nonpartisan league, attend your town council meetings, volunteer for local civic boards and commissions, write letters to the media, participate and educate yourself to gain a firm knowledge of the facts around issues, argue with your neighbors around issues, make your voice heard. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our forum today, and have a good night.
Good night, everybody. Stay well. Stay safe.
Thank you, presenters.